Today, we're sitting down with Cammi Webb-Gannon, and we're talking to her about what's going on with one of our closest neighbours, West Papua. We don't hear bugger all about West Papua, so we're going to find out the latest what's going on there, because that was Anthony Albanese's first overseas trip was to Indonesia. So I wonder if he brought up what's going on with human rights over in West Papua, seeing he's our new rock star Prime Minister. Good morning, Cammi. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Alan. How are you?
I'm terrific. Now, Cammi, can you just let the listener know your background and your involvement in the movement?
Sure. So I am currently a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and I also coordinate the West Papua Project, which is a think tank located at the University of Wollongong. And what we do is we work with West Papuan political leaders, people who are involved in advocacy and activism around West Papua, policymakers in other countries, lawyers, politicians, and also Indonesian politicians when they're interested to try and work towards peace with justice in West Papua. And so my background is in peace and conflict studies.
Yeah, okay.
And I did a PhD on the West Papua conflict, where I looked specifically at the internal politics and mechanisms of the West Papuan independence movement. And I've been an academic and an activist looking at these issues for probably the past 13 or 14 years.
Right. Now, look, I'll just be honest, the reason I got onto it is I was driving around town a few months ago and I saw someone had scrawled on a building site, Free West Papua, and I thought, well, no one ever hears anything about what's going on up there, so hence the trail to try and track you down. Can you give the listener a little bit of an idea about what is really going on up there?
Sure. So West Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea. As you mentioned, most people have heard of Papua New Guinea, which is an independent country which takes up the eastern half of the island. The western half of the island was previously under Dutch colonial administration, and when Indonesia became independent in the 1940s, it decided that it wanted to also make West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea, part of the Indonesian nation state.
It wasn't ceded by the Dutch to them; they just took it. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. So the Dutch, in the kind of post-colonial, post-World War II era, had started to prepare West Papuans for independent nation statehood themselves. But Indonesia was determined that any territory that had previously been administered by the Dutch, so the Dutch East Indies, which became Indonesia, had been administered by the Dutch separately to West Papua, but Indonesia was determined to take any territory that had Dutch administration make it part of its new, nation state territory and within its boundaries. And so when West Papuans in 1960, 1961 had formed an initial kind of government structure, that a New Guinea council, they'd adopted a national anthem, national symbols, and had a number of elite Papuans who were, prepared to form a new independent government. But in 1962, 1963, Indonesia commenced military incursions into the territory, and this was the Cold War period. So Indonesia got what it wanted, essentially. The US said they would not help the Dutch out if it came to a war between the Dutch and Indonesia over West Papua. The US was paranoid that Indonesia would turn communist and go to Russia for weapons and for its support. So the US said to the Dutch, let's sign an agreement here whereby you will hand over West Papua to Indonesia to administer until 1969. At that point, there will be what became known as the Act of Free Choice, but it was going to be a referendum where West Papuans would choose whether they wanted to remain administered and become part of Indonesia or whether they wanted independence. Now, this is where it gets really, really nasty. Basically, Indonesia whitewashed the entire referendum. So the United Nations had been brought in to overlook this referendum in 1969, but the United Nations just turned a blind eye to what was going on. Indonesia handpicked around 1,020, it might be 1,021 Indigenous West Papuans to vote for integration with Indonesia, and they threatened them that they would have their tongues cut out if they didn't. So, of course, those individuals who were handpicked said, let's stay with Indonesia. The United Nations said, all right, the decision's been made, and from that time on, under international, kind of politics, international law, West Papua has been considered part of Indonesia. But West Papuans have fought for the past 6 decades for their own independence, and for good reason. Yeah,
we've got a very high opinion of the United Nations on this station because, they're so effective, Cammi. You know that. And integrity, unbelievable. Now, since that 1969 fiasco, it's all been sort of masked up. So what's going on right today? What sort of stuff is happening today?
Well, let me just give you a tiny bit more history over what's happened over the past 6 decades, so I can kind of tell you what the biggest issues today are. But West Papuans have been experiencing both physical genocide. Between 100,000 and 500,000 West Papuans have been killed under Indonesian occupation, as well as cultural genocide. They've had their land stolen, their cultures silenced, they're persecuted for practicing traditional Indigenous cultures. And in addition to that, and multiple crimes against humanity amongst their rape, torture, starvation, displacement. In addition to that, they have been denied a political voice, which is something that West Papuans consider, we all consider key to our human dignity, is being able to have a political choice and voice in how we are governed.
Free speech.
The free speech, right? They're not allowed to have their own political parties. Of course, this is something that is, widespread across Indonesia. There are no regional political parties, but West Papuans aren't allowed to talk about wanting independence. It's considered treason. If they fly their own political flag, known as the Morning Star, they can receive up to 15 years in prison. There's no foreign media allowed in West Papua. No foreign lawyers. NGOs are very restricted. And so what we have now is a really tragic situation. In the year 2000, just after East Timor became independent, West Papuans thought their time might be just around the corner. And the dictator, Suharto, had just been deposed, had just been, kicked out of power. And so a succession of other presidents came in after him, and one of them was President Gus Dur, who was a bit more sympathetic to West Papuans.
That was the blind guy, wasn't it?
He was, who to his, than his predecessors, and he'd said, well, let's hear from Papuans, what do you actually want? And so a group of forward-thinking political leaders in West Papua got together and they drafted what they called the Special Autonomy Bill. And there were a whole lot of freedoms written into this bill for West Papuans. They would basically, under this bill, be able to govern themselves, but still under, kind of the overall leadership or government of Indonesia. But when this draft bill got to the Indonesian government, the majority of the freedoms were cut out of it. A few of them stayed, though, and one of them was going to be that West Papua could not be broken down into smaller administrative units without the express permission of a political body a political cultural body that was going to be formed in West Papua called the MRP.
And that was set up by the Gustav, or was that by the West Papuans?
This group was part of the bill, and it was going to be set up by Papuans. It was going to feature religious leaders and women leaders and civil society and indigenous leaders. But this group had not yet been set up. Indonesia kept stalling on the setup of this group. And after Gus Dur, another leader came in, Megawati, and she said, I do not care about what was in the Special Autonomy Bill, essentially. Who cares about the formation of this group? I'm going to divide West Papua into 2 provinces. Now, this was extremely significant and extremely bad for West Papuans because what it did was created new governance and administrative positions in West Papua. It allowed Indonesia to send in a lot more Indonesian administrators because they said Papuans weren't up for these governance roles. They weren't, kind of knowledgeable enough. They weren't educated enough. and it allowed them to send in a lot more military. Part of the Special Autonomy Bill also was that the money that was extracted from West Papuan resources, because West Papua is home to the largest gold mine and third largest copper mine in the world. It's owned by an American company, but Indonesia receives enormous
royalties,
revenue from it. Yes, they said that a lot of more of this money will go back into development in West Papua. But what actually happened is that the money went into the pockets of corrupt local elites, both Papuan and Indonesian elites. And it was never seen by the, kind of everyday citizen who
people on the
really
ground. Yes.
needed this money. Yeah,
Yep.
so that was one of a few of the big problems with this divide and conquer strategy of dividing West Papua up into smaller provinces, 2 provinces, and then even smaller proliferation of regencies and, smaller administrative territories. Now, this Special Autonomy Bill had a 20-year lifeline. So last year, it
expired,
essentially ceased to exist.
Yes.
Exactly, and West Papuans were adamant that they did not, that the Special Autonomy Bill was dead. They did not want it again. It was not good for them. They wanted independence, no more special autonomy. But Indonesia decided to go ahead with renewing the Special Autonomy Bill, just kind of rode roughshod over what West Papuans wanted. And it does not include a clause whereby the MRP body, which was eventually established, it has no say over whether further provinces can be kind of implemented in West Papua. So what's happening now is at this very moment, at the end of June, crossing over into July of this year, a bill is sitting before Indonesian lawmakers to divide West Papua into 5 provinces. And Indonesia, essentially, in doing this, is going to be able to send, kind of unlimited amount of military into West Papua, as well as more Indonesian settlers, because these places are going, Indonesia is going to say these places need settling by migrants, and it's going to need more Indonesians to take up the administrative posts.
Yeah, so basically they're going to Indonesianise West Papua.
And West Papuans have been saying that this has been happening for decades. Well, this is almost kind of the last nail in the coffin of West Papuans' hopes for achieving their own governance.
And has there been much physical pushback from West Papua about this?
There have been demonstrations for the past 2 years.
Have not heard of it at all, Cammi.
Okay, yeah. So mass demonstrations, a lot of, very well articulated arguments by Papuan activists about why this is not in West Papuans' best interest. But Indonesia just does not listen. Well, part of the problem as well is that there are some corrupt local elites or local elites who work in Jakarta's interests. And so some of Indonesia is saying that they have some local government leaders on side for this, but they do not represent the interests of the vast majority of West Papuans. No. And what's happened at these rallies of late is that some of them have turned violent. What Indonesia often does is send in military to kind of, police and military to
Well, that's sort of what they did in East Timor as well.
Exactly. And then there's also local militias that come in and aggravate the situation as well. And they turn violent, and then Indigenous West Papuan activists are arrested and put in jail for inciting violence and treason. Yeah.
Now, Cammi, what's the response? Two questions. What's the response of the Australian government to all this, and also the United Nations? What's their stance on it?
So the Australian government, there's basically there is radio silence from the Australian government on this recently. We've seen that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese go to Indonesia to what Indonesia and Australia have called reset the relationship. But
what's that really mean to West Papuans?
It meant nothing to West Papuans. The issue of West Papua was left completely off the agenda. Australia doesn't want to touch West Papua. Since Australia led the
East Timor,
humanitarian intervention, Indonesia has not, the diplomatic relationship between the two countries, Australia and Indonesia, has never fully recovered. Indonesia remains very suspicious about Australians' intentions with regard to West Papua. And so Indonesia is constantly trying to reassure the Indonesian government that it respects Indonesia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that applies to West Papua. And this is because, Australia has significant business interests.
Of course.
Trading relationships with Indonesia. It's concerned about security. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. So it's concerned about terrorism and has strong counter-terrorism agreements with Indonesia.
So
we are involved.
Yeah, so the Australian government's basically doing another East Timor 1975. They're just, we're out here, we don't want to hear anything about it. Okay.
That's right.
And the freeloaders in New York, what's their position?
The United Nations. Well, what's happened is there have been many calls from Pacific Island countries over the past decade, probably 5 to 7 years at least, and other supporters of West Papua around the world to send the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights into West Papua to undertake a thorough investigation. The problem with the UN is that it doesn't have teeth, so it's waiting for Indonesia to invite the UN in, and
good
Indonesia
luck with that.
Has stalled on this for years. And so Indonesia's answer to that was, what we're going to do instead is invite individual ministers from regional governments, individual parliamentarians, politicians in. And then they have, they're given highly bespoke tours of West Papua. They're said, told to speak to this person and to that person and look at this dance and that, kind of feast. And then they're just quickly ushered out of West Papua and they're told to go home and tell, their own countries and governments that nothing's happened. So, that everything's fine in West Papua. So, it's, they've got the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights, which is, it's Indonesia's turn right now at the UN, and, a number of countries and NGOs, including the West Papua Project at Wollongong, has submitted, put forward submissions saying, where Indonesia is falling down. I mean,
have they been accepted, Cammi?
Violating West Papuan human rights. Sorry?
Have they been accepted?
Well, they're all accepted. They're tabled and they're, being looked at the moment. But again, what comes out of it, besides a bit of naming and shaming, is essentially very little. Yeah. And I think that the UN ultimately would be embarrassed to have to admit to an outrageous failing in 1969 when it, was in charge of the Act of Free Choice, but basically...
And it abrogated its responsibilities. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah. Now, this is a long shot. What about Holland? What's their stance on it?
Well, over the years, we've had some fantastic academics from Holland who have seen it as, their national responsibility to...
from a government point of view, Cammi?
Yeah, well, okay. So Holland is home to a large refugee and diaspora population. So that, since Indonesia's takeover, they've accepted a lot of West Papuans, and now there's a kind of thriving West Papuan diaspora population there. But earlier this year, the Netherlands came out as the 83rd country in the world supporting calls for a United Nations representative for the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner to visit West Papua, and then I think it was just in April that the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House in the Netherlands held a public hearing on the issue of West Papua, and they invited the West Papuan Provisional Government, which is located in the UK at the moment because it can't fit within West Papua, to address the Foreign Affairs Committee and to look at what's happening and to see how they can lend their support.
Yeah, I take it of those 83 nations, Australia isn't one of them?
No, not... Well, it's hard to give a precise answer on that because Australia was part of the Pacific Island Nations Forum where an official communique was, I think, from maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, where the official communique came out and called for the United Nations representative to go into West Papua. So Australia's name is part of that communique. So on its own, no, it probably would not have called for that, but because it's part of the Pacific Islands Forum, it's involved.
Right. So how can we stay abreast of what's going on up there, Cammi, from a standard Australian citizen? How do we keep abreast of what's going on up there?
Well, some of the best information is coming out on social media. What you could do is follow the Free West Papua campaign. That is the campaign led by the Office of Benny Wender, who's the president in waiting, I suppose, of the provisional government, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua. So have a look at, follow them on Twitter, look at their website. You can follow the work of the West Papua Project. We have a web page at the University of Wollongong.
And what is it?
Where it's called the West Papua Project. If you just Google West Papua Project, it comes straight up.
Okay.
And we hold a repository of information about what's happening in West Papua. We hold seminars from leading West Papuan intellectuals, lawyers, people on the ground. And what else can you do to stay abreast of the situation? I mean, mainstream media is increasingly including stories, but, sporadically.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, here's the best one. Find the Australia West Papua Association and find them on Facebook and follow them, because you will get several updates daily on what's happening in West Papua. So that's run by, there are different Australia West Papua Association groups around Australia, but the Sydney one's particularly active in producing a newsletter, and it's run by a person named Joe Collins with the support of his partner Anne Noonan. And, there are other Australia West Papua Association groups, for example, in South Australia. That group was involved in fundraising to help West Papuan students stay in Australia after Indonesia cut off all support to West Papuan students overseas. So different Australia West Papua associations are good. If you Google them, you'll find out where your local one is, and you can join them and become involved if you wanted to.
Okay. All right, Cammi, thanks very much for your time today, and I hope we can talk again in more positive terms.
That'd be my pleasure to do that at some stage. Thanks, Alan.